Hi everyone. So today I would like to talk about why some works are translated rather than others. And I'll try to keep this relatively general, so perhaps it could apply to non-English translation as well. There's a lot of things that are different, like each country has different priorities, regardless if it's a developed or undeveloped country in the world. So works that are being translated into English for Canada could be different from the US, or English works in Canada could be different from Britain. And then of course if you have Canada and say France, they're all very different, right? For that reason, I'll try to keep this as just an introduction to this subject. It's something that I want to keep discussing as the years go by. And it's just a lot of this I think could fall under just simple common knowledge. I think almost anybody who would sit down and take the time to consider why something is translated, perhaps they would come up with maybe a similar list. And then of course you can go into greater detail and you can apply these topics to your specific country and of course the languages that your country speaks and the specific priorities that your country has. So I will include fiction and non-fiction as much as possible. Obviously some of these situations would only apply to fiction, and some of them of course would only apply to non-fiction, and I'll clarify which one when those come up in this discussion. So there's 4 basic reasons that something would be translated. The first one, commercial interest. Just basically, if something is going to be translated, the translator has to be paid, the publishing house has to be paid, whether it's like an independent translator or like a fan is translating a work and they're just going to publish it onto a blog. That could be a little bit different than the traditional form of publishing. So of course you have the complexities and the details if they're going to publish it either as an indie book or as a traditional avenue of publication. Those have their own nuances. But when you boil it right down, it has to have a commercial interest. It has to be something that people are going to want to buy, or if it's like a form of activism, people are going to want to support the ideas that are being translated, and they want to spread this awareness and this news and everything. So if the book, the original book, if it's widely popular in the original country, then it could become trendy to translate it. Like The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo would be one really good example. That's like a New York Times bestseller. And there's movies made about it's a whole franchise. So that's one really good example in that case. Another reason that falls under commercial interest could be maybe it's a trend. So it could have mass appeal, like vampires are a current popular trend right now. So there's that foreign film, Let the Right One In. I'm pretty sure that's a vampire movie, but that was made by Hollywood, but it's really popular. And Ju-on is another one. They made the American adaptation for it. That's getting off topic, but Harry Potter for books could probably apply here, because I'm pretty sure that there's some really interesting translation things that happened with Harry Potter in terms of the names, which would be really interesting to look into. So it's like Beatles mania, right? How would that affect the translation? So obviously it's a huge hit, so it's going to be translated into a lot of different languages, and because it's a huge hit in advance, there's almost a guarantee it's going to be profitable. And then the last one for commercial interest would be the author has a solid fan base. So if they, like Murakami, the Japanese writer, he has really devoted fans. So anytime he has a new book that's released in Japan, there's fans already lined up and ready to buy his next book. So this would certainly fall under commercial interest. The next main point would be the book is deemed worthy by somebody. Now that somebody, it would vary, and that would that could be a really interesting topic to discuss in detail and apply it to different countries and different situations. Apply it specifically to nonfiction. For example, who deems something worthy of being translated and why? What's their agenda? What's their goals? Is it a love of literature? Is it because this is it has important nonfiction research that should be spread all over the world? The deemed by somebody, it could be, maybe it's a prize-winning book, so perhaps it's a Nobel Peace Prize-winning nonfiction, or a fiction, of course, or a journal article, or journalism category. That could certainly apply. Or, of course, we have the PEN International. We have every country has their own prestigious prizes, and there's a whole different variety of different kinds of prizes. There's some indie prizes, there's I guess the Hugo Awards. So there's all these different prize-winning books, prize-winning circles. So perhaps that could be, they would consider this book worthy of being translated because it won this prize. There's some prizes that are devoted only to translated works or specific languages. So then the next one to fall under deemed worthy by someone would be the author is a celebrated writer or researcher in their home country. Again, this is a little bit different from having a solid fan base. They could be just really prestigious and well respected. Perhaps they have like a related career in something, and then they finally come out with a book that they have been spending a lot of time on. So that could be, like, for example, I guess biographies could fall into this category, where if somebody has, like, I Am Malala would be a really good example of this. Her biography is just absolutely amazing. So that, and she gave a speech, I believe it was at the UN. So that single moment in history is so monumental that her work would be translated into a wide variety of languages. And she is very well regarded because of her activism and her power. Her work would be deemed worthy by many people to be translated. So the next one, under deemed worthy by someone, would be the host country's publisher or governing body wants to promote this aspect of culture. An example of this is K-pop was mass-produced for export. I got that information from Netflix Explained. It's a TV show on Netflix. And they mentioned the K-pop group from 1992, whose Sateji. And are there any countries where something like this could apply? Murakami, for example, or Japanese manga, they're very popular because of the loyal fan bases, or because Japan is exporting their culture abroad? So in the case of K-pop, it was a commercial interest and they needed to export something for financial profit. And creating this mass movement of K-pop as a commercial music industry, it could produce and generate a lot of income for the country and the music producers. And of course, create culture around the world. So there would be an interest in Korea as a country, and of course perhaps get tourism and stuff. So Japan they're experts at this. A lot of the words there's some words that Korea would actually share with Japan, but it's usually the Japanese word that becomes dominant and is commonly used in English conversation, like sushi or nori, these kind of things, because Japan, they're really good at exporting their culture. So we have the Japanese manga, the anime, these kind of things. Somebody is trying to export their culture to make a profit or generate tourism into the country. So that is how they deem it worthy, possibly. That one's very interesting and very complex to discuss in like a minute or less. So the next one is it has cultural or research value. I touched on this one already. It could also fall under deemed worthy by someone, or the host country's publisher wants to promote that aspect of culture. So, for example, tracing our literary roots, this could fall under a newly discovered or deciphered manuscript So if there's archaeologists and they make a discovery and they are amazed and they have deciphered a new ancient language, that would be of worldwide interest, especially if we can trace our own culture going back to that artifact. That becomes culturally relative and culturally important and possibly something to teach in history classes. And another one that falls under cultural or research value would be funding for these projects that go under research or literary grants. So to decipher that discovered artifact requires probably a funding grant so that the scholar can have the time to translate it and decipher the script. And the last point to touch on is political or research reasons. So this one, during Soviet Russia, works were smuggled out of the country. In some cases, that could be the only reason that some of these books survive for us today. They may have been lost or censored or destroyed if they were not smuggled out. And they were smuggled out primarily, in some cases, by American countries needing or wanting to get information about Russia. So they smuggled those books out of the country to try to find out what is happening in Russia. I think the term is behind the Iron Curtain. And so that's very political. This can also fall under possibly journalism or valuable journalist articles or papers from war zones or conflict areas. In some cases, this could be one of the few or only ways that we can find out what's actually happening in some of these really dangerous areas. So we would definitely rely on the journalists. And then, of course, the journalist may not always only be an English speaker. They might be a speaker of that local culture because they have to live there and get access to this information. So that covers, as best as I can, a general introduction for this topic. The four main points, I guess, would be commercial interest, deemed worthy by someone, have cultural or research value, and some political or research reasons. I guess to expand on that last one a little bit more, we need to understand different countries, conflicts that are happening. So we need to get access to these books and these articles so that we can try to find out what's happening in these situations and hopefully try to find solutions and try to reduce the conflict that's happening. And so, in conclusion, the point of this is to show there's many different reasons for something being translated, possibly highlight why some works would be left out from ever being translated. For the reasons that we translate things, there's so many more texts and books and articles that are never translated into English, or they only have a conversation between two languages, and English is not one of those languages. But most of all, to still try and understand just how much isn't being translated. If we examine new releases in Canada for English books, there's a lot. Most of our books are probably imported from the US. If we consider how many books are being published each year around the world, in both fiction and non-fiction, not all of those books are translated into English. So there's just a huge wealth of information that will never be translated into English. And there's even more reasons why something would not be translated into English than why something would be translated into English. And of course, English can apply to your home country's language as well. It doesn't only have to apply to English. And of course, you're welcome to join in and make a response video or add to this, especially if you're from a different country that uses different languages, or if your country's situation has something unique to add, or if I missed something and you just want to add to this conversation, because I think this is really interesting. So, and that's all. I'll leave it at that. And that's all. Thanks for listening. Bye, everyone.